was a cold and foggy evening in Beijing, and as the night grew darker, so did the roads. Li Wei, a young university student, rushed to the bus stop. He had heard eerie stories about Bus 375, but brushed them off as silly urban legends. Tonight, however, he was about to learn the chilling truth. The bus was late, as usual, but it finally arrived, an old, creaky vehicle that had clearly seen better days. The door screeched open and Li Wei stepped on. The air inside felt heavy and stale, as if it hadn't been properly ventilated for years. The driver, an elderly man with sunken eyes, didn't say a word. The bus was almost empty, with only a few passengers scattered across the dimly lit seats. Li Wei took a seat near the middle, putting his headphones on to drown out the unsettling atmosphere. The bus started moving, its engine groaning under the weight of the journey ahead. He tried to relax, telling himself it was just another routine ride home, but something about the night felt ... off. As the bus made its way along the winding road, they passed through the outskirts of the city, where streetlights became sparse and the fog thickened. Li Wei glanced around at the other passengers. There was an old woman knitting a scarf in the front, a businessman typing frantically on his laptop, and a young couple whispering to each other in hushed tones. But something strange caught his eye. No one else seemed bothered by the odd atmosphere, as if they were all in a trance, detached from reality. After a few stops, the bus came to a halt at a deserted station. The fog outside was so thick that nothing beyond the station sign was visible. The doors hissed open, and 3 people stepped on board, 2 men in dark suits and a woman dressed in traditional, outdated clothing. Their faces were pale, almost lifeless, and their eyes, though barely visible under the shadows, seemed to have an unnatural gleam. The driver didn't acknowledge them. He simply closed the doors, and the bus continued its journey. Li Wei felt a shiver run down his spine. The air inside grew colder, and the eerie silence became unbearable. He noticed that the 3 newcomers weren't sitting together but had spread out across the bus, each taking a seat in different sections, far from the other passengers. Something about them seemed wrong. Li Wei's instincts screamed at him that he was in danger, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Suddenly, the old woman knitting up front stood and walked to the driver. Li Wei removed his headphones to hear what she was saying. "Driver," the woman's voice trembled. "Something's wrong. These people, those who just boarded, they're not human." The bus driver didn't react, keeping his eyes on the road, but the passengers, including Li Wei, were now listening intently. The businessmen stopped typing, and the couple stopped whispering. The eerie trio remained still, showing no signs of having heard the old woman's accusation. The woman pressed on. "I've lived in this area for over 60 years. I know what I'm talking about. They're ghosts, spirits, whatever you want to call them. They don't belong here." The bus driver's grip tightened on the wheel, but he didn't respond. Instead, the bus seemed to accelerate, the engine groaning louder as they sped through the foggy night. Li Wei's heart pounded in his chest. The fear in the air was palpable now, and everyone felt it. The bus was no longer just a mode of transportation, it had become a cage. One of the men in the dark suit slowly turned his head toward Li Wei, locking eyes with him. His face was expressionless, but his eyes, those eyes were hollow, deep voids that seemed to pull Li Wei into an abyss. A cold sweat broke out on Li Wei's forehead as he quickly looked away, feeling the suffocating weight of something sinister watching him. Just then, the young couple at the back of the bus stood up abruptly. The woman was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get off now," she cried, pulling at her partner's arm. They rushed to the driver, begging him to stop the bus, but the driver remained stone-faced, his eyes locked on the road as if he, too, was under some kind of spell. Without warning, the bus jerked violently to the left, and the passengers were thrown against their seats. The businessman dropped his laptop, and the old woman clung to her knitting needles. Li Wei gasped for air, gripping the seat in front of him. The bus had taken a sharp turn onto an unfamiliar, desolate road, one that wasn't part of its usual route. The fog outside thickened, becoming an impenetrable wall of white. The road ahead was a twisted maze of darkness and shadows. Li Wei's mind raced. He had to do something, anything, to escape this nightmare. But before he could act, the bus screeched to a halt, its tires skidding on the gravel. The doors opened with a slow, ominous hiss. The two men in suits stood up simultaneously and walked toward the exit. The woman in the traditional clothing followed them, her face still hidden in the shadows. They stepped off the bus, disappearing into the fog without a word. For a moment, everything was still. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, unsure of what had just happened. The air inside the bus lightened, and the oppressive weight lifted. The driver, as if waking from a dream, blinked and finally spoke. "Next stop," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The bus slowly resumed its journey, returning to the familiar city streets. When Li Wei looked around, he noticed something peculiar. The businessman had vanished. The young couple? Gone too. Only the old woman remained, sitting quietly, knitting as if nothing had happened. Li Wei's heart raced as he tried to process it all. The bus came to Li Wei's stop, and as he stumbled off, the old woman looked up at him with a knowing smile. "Not everyone gets off the bus," she whispered as the doors closed behind him. Li Wei stood frozen as the bus disappeared into the fog, the chilling realization setting in. He had survived bus 375, but what about the others? What had he really witnessed that night? Were those passengers ever human, or had something far more terrifying shared the ride with him? The legend of bus 375 lived on, but Li Wei would never forget, because some nights the fog rolls in and a bus appears, carrying passengers who were never meant to return. And sometimes the question remains, are the passengers human?